Hi, there's O'Connor. We are up to concealment and we are getting 1/3 of the way through the different learning modules. So exciting. And this one is because we are looking at concealment. This is after the Theft Act has taken place, and we want to investigate documentary evidence, obtaining documentary evidence, hard to get documentary evidence, and questions about disputed documents and so forth. The fraud investigator's role, very important. As we get higher up that pyramid, things get more expensive. Wow. So let's get into the learning objectives. You want to be able to describe concealment investigation methods, understand the value of physical documents and electronic records in a fraud investigation, list the different methods of obtaining documentary evidence, understand how to perform discovery sampling, and explain extended procedures for hard-to-get documentary evidence. Now, what we've got here is concealment investigative methods. There's a document perspective. While many methods of concealment are possible, all right, concealment is generally accomplished by manipulating documentary evidence. On the other hand, from the electronic perspective, concealment is accomplished by modifying or deleting records in corporate databases, logs, and communications. Wow. Okay. So aspects of documentary evidence. Now, already you're probably thinking, wow, this learning module is potentially boring, potentially dull, dry. In some ways it is, but at the same time, the documents are a foundational evidence tool in all court and civil proceedings. And it is boring because documents don't jump up and say hello to you. Documents are what they are, whereas people are more interesting, right? But the problem is witnesses or people is they lose their memory. Number two, they have different recollections, they perceive different things, and so witnesses cannot always be relied on, whereas documents, the dull and boring documents, can be relied on. And that's why I want to show you and mean by this picture. If you had the choice between bringing documents into a court case versus some witness statement, the documents will win in many times because they do not change. And whereas people can change, people's memories can fade and so forth. Ah, wow. All right. So let's have a look at the counsel check. You can see there's many aspects of a document that you can investigate and look at to get a sense of who wrote the check, who sent the check, where was the check sent to. And in the same way, in e-commerce situations, you can get similar information through the wiring of different monies. Where was the money wired from? Where was the money wired to? And so forth. Let's have a look at Australian fraud cases that I've presented earlier. And we can have a look at these different colours representing different types of documents: contract documents, altered records, financial records, tax returns, fake identities. And you can see across the different fraud investigation methods, notice that they rely on more than one type of document, except, say, covert operation just relied on financial records, but surveillance relied on grant applications, fake identities. It relied on financial records. It relied on contract documents. And the same with audit evidence. 5 different types of documents were relied on for audit evidence presented to these successful fraud cases. So this is why documentary evidence is so valuable. Let's have a look at another graph. And you can see that here are the different types of scandal at the bottom, going from corruption, healthcare fraud, tax fraud, scam fraud, loan fraud, misuse of funds, and so forth. Notice that financial records was a common type of documentary evidence in a majority of these frauds, followed by fake identities was quite common too, especially with the government grant fraud and cybercrime. And if you look at altered records, that featured in corruption and that featured in medical fraud. So you can see your understanding of these different types of documents helps you to be more pervasive in terms of the types of fraud that you are able to investigate. Wow. All right. So what about documentary evidence handling? Now, let's not worry about all the different mind maps, but let's go through these 5 areas. Number 1, careful records must be maintained. Well, that's a no-brainer. Chain of custody. We talked about checksums in the last learning module, receipt records, document tracking. You have to keep receipts for your tax return. Number 2, the marking of evidence, marked with a unique ID and securely stored. So we need to be able to mark and store the evidence. Number 3, we need to have a consistent organization of the documents, including a consistent record of the evidence. So 3A and 3B go together. Number 4, this is the interesting part because there is software out there that can help you to manage and organize and coordinate evidence. And this is so critical when you have across people use of investigation analysis software across different teams of individuals, and you've got to coordinate the different sources that are coming in from different people and get everyone onto the same page. And so Xanalysis and I2 Analyst Notebook are softwares that are frequently used today by fraud investigators, by other criminal investigators and lawyers in the world today. Finally, rules of procedure. You need to understand rules of procedure, the difference between originals and copies. Of course, the originals are more important than copies. However, you cannot always have originals in some cases where they're not available. They're already subject to some other litigation, or they have been lost or damaged, or they're in some sort of custody. Then you may be permitted to use photocopies instead. So these are all the different aspects of documentary evidence handling. But note this, all right? The same thing that we covered in LM7. You need to have a chain of custody, all right? Checksums, but it need to be properly marked and recorded. And then 3, properly organized, properly coordinated. Number 4, and finally, you need to follow rules of procedure. Use the originals where you can. Wow. All right. Obtaining documentary evidence. So, of course, through auditing and through discovery sampling. Now, you learn all about auditing in another unit. My job is not to teach you auditing here, but just be aware that auditors conduct 7 types of tests: accuracy, analytical, documentation, confirmations, observations, physical examinations, and inquiries. So inventory stock take would be a physical examination, or confirmations could be a title search for a property that you claim to have. All right. So auditors, it is their bread and butter to go out and conduct these tests all the time. What about discovery sampling? This is another way of looking at documentary evidence where you don't have time to actually look at all documents in the population. You need to just do some sampling to make some hypotheses about the total population. So what do we mean by here? Well, what we mean is that you're going to be working with a random sample, okay? And number 2, then you're using probability theory to draw inferences about the population from the sample. So let's have an example that in the textbook where a defense auditor wanted to use discovery sampling to examine checks payable to doctors. Remember, the fraud was where many, many fictitious doctors were made up. So claims were made and then checks were sent out to the fictitious doctors, and then the fraudster was able to get those checks, bank them, and then take the money. So what would the defense auditor have done? First, get a random number generator, like from here, and then use this to pick out, say, 300 checks from the 10,000 checks that were written. That's step one. Okay. And electronically, you could actually do the same rather than just referring to a table. Step two, and that is use a discovery sampling table. You look at the 300 checks and check off each one. Check, 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 check. Okay, we do not find any fraud in those 300 checks. So what does this table mean? This table means that if you did not find any fraud, then you can be 95% confident that there's 1 or less than 1% of fraudulent checks in the rest of the sample. You could be 78% confident that there's less than 0.5% in that sample. All right, the 0.5% of the checks. Now, 0.5% of 10,000 checks, that's 50 checks. So you can be 78% that there are 50 or less fraudulent checks in the sample of 10,000. You can be 95% that there are 100 or less fraudulent checks in the sample of 10,000. Well, if you want to be more confident, maybe you draw out 1,500 checks and you can be 99% confident that's less than 5, or 95% that there are less than 20 checks in the 10,000. All right. So this is what we mean by a discovery sampling table. So step one is have a random sample. Step two is to actually take the sample and count how many fraudulent checks are in that sample. And then you will infer via this table about what level of confidence you can have towards the total population of checks in that company, of that 10,000 population. Okay, so what we got next is the consideration of sampling and non-sampling risk. And again, they're not opposites. Sampling risk is that the sample was not representative of the population. So that's why step one is so important. That is, you have to take a random sample. So the two ways of reducing sampling risk is to increase the sample size from 300 to 400 to 500, or make sure you use a random number generator to select the items to be examined. So the sampling risk is that these little parts that you sampled are not representative of the rest of the population, okay? All right. Now that's different from a non-sampling risk where you actually pick out your sample and you make a judgment about the evidence, but it is not representative of the population. This happens because of the wrong audit procedure or a calculation error, or the auditor interpreted the results incorrectly. All right. So careful planning, careful performance and evaluation of the sampling procedure are critical to reducing non-sampling risk. Having a random sample is the best way to reduce sampling risk. So keep these things in mind. It's very important in your auditing, in your discovery of evidence when you don't have time to look at the total population. This is the end of part one. In the next part, we will look at hard to get documentary evidence. See you in the next part. Bye for now.